Okay, hello everyone. We've got a great panel here to kind of broaden the discussion and talk about some of the key factors that are driving up the price of housing and how we can address them, what kind of policies we need. But before we do so, I just want to thank Tsahai for that excellent presentation. I think so often when we talk about how to expand access to affordable housing, the conversation really quickly turns to the question of how to build more supply, what kind of new supply is needed to meet that rise in demand that's driving up the price of housing. But this report reminds us of an important fact, which is that a fast-growing share of that demand for housing is coming from a small group of wealthy investors who are able to leverage existing portfolios of housing and outbid prospective homeowners. And if you want to understand the decline in the rate of home ownership over the last 10 years, it's a pretty important factor. So just for example, in the city of Toronto, for all of the housing that's been built over the last 10 years, over the last decade, for home ownership, just over half of that housing is being bought up by investors and is now non-owner occupied. And so, I think this raises a very serious question about who is going to be able to attain the 3.5 million new units that the federal government is committing to. In the absence of decision makers taking seriously the kind of policy options that Tsahai's report are recommending of us. But at this point, I'm excited to kind of bring in this panel to think about a broader discussion about some of the key factors that are driving up the price of housing. And I'll just begin by introducing. We have on the far left Mike Moffat, who is a senior director for the Smart Prosperity Institute. We have Dil Poir, who is government relations for the Canadian Real Estate Association. We have Col Salem, who is the chairperson for the Squamish Nation Council, they're involved in some very interesting housing projects, which I hope we're going to hear more about. And we have Carolyn Weitzman, and Carolyn is the expert advisor to the Housing Assessment Resource Tool, which is a project out of UBC. And she is also a housing and social policy researcher affiliated with the University of Ottawa. So I'm just going to start up by asking a broad question, and I want each of you to comment on what you see as the key factors that are driving up the price of housing, price of ownership housing, such that a growing majority of residents are unable to afford ownership. But at the same time, what are key factors that are driving up the price of rent to a level that's become unaffordable for so many? So Mike, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and thanks everyone for being here. So I think how we can start by answering this question is looking at prices across the country and asking ourselves, okay, why is it that Windsor, Ontario has higher prices than Montreal? Why is it that Woodstock, Ontario has higher prices than Calgary? And Tillsonburg, we all know from the Stomp and Tom song, has higher prices than Edmonton. So I think we need to look at this from a geographic point of view, because we're not seeing prices go up at the same rate across the country. And it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that the places where real estate is expensive and going up the most are the places where the population is growing faster than the housing stock. Full stop. We ask ourselves, okay, well, why is it that we have, a decline in ownership? Well, in the province of Ontario, since 2015, we have added 400,000 non-permanent residents. These are international students and graduates and some temporary foreign workers. And, you add a large population of people who want to rent, that's going to give you, that's going to change those figures. And we've also just kind of decided as a society that we don't want them buying property. We're putting in foreign buyers taxes and bans and things like that. So we're increasing the population of non-permanent residents, we're banning them from buying, and then we're wondering, why do we have so many renters? Why do we have so many investors who are buying up properties to rent them out? Well, it's not tough to figure out that we need more housing. If we're going to grow our economy this way, if we're going to increase international enrollments, and I think that's a good thing. I'm a university professor. I teach a lot of these students. They're fantastic people. We need to make sure that we have enough housing for them, and that's why we're seeing such investor demand to buy up properties, because there are so many people in this country who want to rent, who legally have to rent, because we're banning them from owning property. Well, we need to make sure that we have the rental properties available for them.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Dill.
And thank you so much. So just building upon that, I hate to boil it down to basics, but the truth of the matter is that it is really simply economics 101, right? Supply and demand. The truth is that we do have a shortage of housing in this country. And Jeremy, to your point, no one's actually committed to building that 3.5 million. We've just identified the problem. So that means that we do have a shortage in this country of 3.5 million units of housing. And to build on Mike's point, demand is continuing to go up across the country, right? So unless we can do something to put a dent in that 3.5 million that we need across this country, those housing prices, both in the rental and the market space, will continue to go up, right? And so the truth is that really is the crux of the problem. And the truth is that that's what we need. We need innovation in the housing space. We need to be able, right now, we can currently only build 500,000 units of housing per year. We have given it our utmost best to try to build more, and we've built 50,000 more. So that 50,000 more that we've built this year is not enough to put a dent in the 3.5 million units of housing that we're missing across this country. And so really, that's what it boils down to. What do we need to do to build those 3.5 million units that are missing across this country? And so,
Go ahead, Kalsana.
Thank you. Appreciate the question. And so there's from my sense of it, there's a confluence of a few things. I mean, the housing shortage, I think, is very true, and it's a very accurate description of the challenges. And just as not to belabor the point too much, because I think it's already been raised by the previous two, but just as an example, I just had to look at my phone because I don't have access to a printer anymore. I'm a millennial. So Vancouver in the 1970s, and I'm very BC-based and Vancouver-based in most of my analysis, but because it's where I was raised and I grew up and most of my work is. But in Vancouver in the 1970s, from 1970 to 1979, Vancouver had an average of 12.8 housing construction completions per 1,000 residents. In the 2010s, in the last decade, it was 7.7. That means that there were 66 more completions per capita in the 1970s. In total numbers, Vancouver averaged 18,000 completions in a year in 2010s. But if Vancouver had been building at the same rate as the 1970s, it would have been completing 31,000. So you add that difference of 10 years, just the 10 years, that's a difference of 125,000 units that weren't built if we were building at the same rate we were building at in the 70s. And the truth of the matter, and it's Jill Atke, who's the CEO for the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, makes this point that the majority of affordable housing in Canada and in BC is privately owned. It's a lot of rental that was built in the 1970s with federal assistance, but privately owned, developer-built rental 50 years ago that's now deeply affordable. And we're not building enough of that same type of housing today that's going to become the affordable housing in 20 or 30 years as well, depending on a lot of circumstances. So that's one of the points. But the other one that I think often doesn't get talked about enough, and as a reality, is in the 1980s and 90s, housing markets in the hot places like the urban centers and the suburban areas were not seeing 20% value increases on property and on land the way we have seen in the last decade, when interest rates were 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17%. So the federal fiscal policy to drop interest rates over the last decade, and it's not just Canada, around the world, has churned a lot of places into very expensive markets. And Vancouver Toronto, a lot of other cities around the world are struggling with the same challenges at different scales. And now we're also seeing sort of movement and migration patterns also start to affect areas and markets that previously wouldn't be thought of as, oh, that's a really expensive place to live, or housing is going up in those areas because people are bleeding out into the places where it's a little bit more accessible for them to get into. So there's a couple of pieces there. One is the interest rate policy has a direct impact on supply and demand and who has access to capital and how cheap that capital is to be able to deploy it in certain ways. And then the other challenge, the flip side of that, is we have a land use policy by and large through most of the country that focuses on using one of the most expensive forms of housing that houses the fewest amount of people per square foot with single detached housing in most of our cities. Toronto, Vancouver, et cetera, are included in this. Vancouver, although most people might think of it as, oh, they're building a lot of towers, it's condos everywhere, Vancouver is build, build, build. Reality is 80% of Vancouver is zoned mostly for single detached housing. And we focus a lot of high-rise development in greenfield and brownfield areas, former industrial lands or government lands, and we still practice that policy. Or we focus on mid-range development on very polluted arterials to protect the single detached homeowners so that they don't have to experience any form of density. So the land use question is part of the problem. The interest rates contribute to that problem. And then I think the political sort of economy around housing and housing issues, and in terms of kind of pointing a little bit towards a solution, is that most of our provinces have set up arrangements in terms of municipal governance that largely give cities powers to build cities as we built them in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Cities in Canada do not have the powers that they need in the 21st century to build the cities that we need for the 21st century. And so that, all of those things, in my mind, contribute to the factors that lead to rents going up 20, 30% year over year, housing prices going up massively in some of these very constrained markets. So I think those are the factors that I think about when I think about this problem.
Thank you. Go ahead, Carly.
Look, you're not going to hear very much change in from what I have to say. I'm just going to approach things from a slightly different perspective, which is a social policy perspective. There's a basic rule about social policy. If you've got an essential good, whether it be education, whether it be healthcare, whether it be housing, you either, as a government, need to provide it directly, or at the very least, you need to steer it. So if you were providing health care and you decided, because you're a good neoliberal, that the best way to provide health care is let 1,000 flowers bloom and let 1,000 providers compete, you still might want to step in if there was someone calling themselves a doctor and saying, you know what the solution is? Eat raw meat only. So the metaphor here is in the 70s and 80s, Canada had about 250,000 new builds, new completions a year. About 10% of that was nonprofit housing. It probably wasn't enough, but it was a really important component of the social safety net. From the late 1980s onward, the federal government absolved itself of responsibility for this basic policy good, which was housing, and said, let 1,000 private developers bloom. And what's happened since then is that, for instance, between 1991 and, between 2011 and 2016, 15 affordable homes at $750 or less have been lost for every single nonprofit home built. The whole panel has been saying so far, and I would certainly lead with, we need to double nonprofit housing production. But we also need to accept that even if nonprofit housing was production was doubled, even if we got to levels of 10% of total construction, 90% of new homes would still be built by the private sector. And we need to be able to steer that in terms of what can people afford, what kinds of sizes of homes are needed, where are they needed? They're needed right now desperately in big cities in order to avoid the environmental sprawl disaster of young families and young people being priced out of cities. And they need to be also looked at from an equity lens, a gender and intersectional equity lens. The most common group of households to be in core housing need, to have unaffordable or unsuitable housing, are single mothers. We need to accept that reality. We need to accept the fact that the average income of a single mother in core housing need is about $23,000 a year. They can afford a maximum of $650. We have to start off with the discussion either about a whole new welfare and minimum wage regime, or how we can deliver much more two-bedroom housing for $650, because it's $3,000 right now in Vancouver. It's $2,800 right now in Toronto.
Okay, great. So I want to focus us in now on quite a practical question about what are the policies and actions that the governments can take right now to help address this crisis. We've heard a lot about the concern with new supply and with steering supply. And so, in that light, I'm very interested. We have these ambitious targets. We say commitments. I hear you, Dill, that these are targets. But if governments are to help push forward to get 3.5 million new homes, in the coming decade, how can we be sure that this supply is not as current market supply, is. Very responsive to high-income residents, increasingly responsive to wealthy investors. But instead, how can we ensure that this new supply becomes more responsive to the unmet housing needs that communities across Canada are experiencing? The need for housing affordable to a range of incomes, the need for more accessible housing, more family-sized housing, more purpose-built rentals, and certainly purpose-built rentals for students, as I think Mike has rightly.
Can I just start with a quick correction? We keep on saying 3.5 million. We're actually talking about 3.5 additional. We're talking about 5.8 million over the next decade. That's 580,000 a year. As I say, we've just now, in about 2021, hit the levels of the 70s of 250,000 a year, and the population of Canada, sneak alert, has doubled. In 1971, we had 21 million people in Canada. Now we're edging on towards 40 million. So we need a whole new housing approach and system. We're talking about 5.8. We're not talking about 3.5. Read Mike's stuff.
Okay, so
And it's to get us to, I can't remember the year, it's to get us to what level of affordability again?
2004.
2004 level of affordability, which wasn't even that affordable, if people remember that time.
So again, if you're using the median multiple, which is just one measure, in the 1970s, the Canadian government was in full-on panic because the proportion between average household income and average home price had gone up from 2.5 to 3. It's 12 now in Vancouver. It's almost 11 in Toronto. So I don't know what you can, and in the 1970s, home ownership was affordable for moderate income, what we call working people. I don't know what we could possibly do to get home prices back down to a point where they would be affordable for a young person or a young couple on a moderate wage. This is like, you'd need to get home prices to a quarter of what they are now, at least in Vancouver.
Sure. So just we're gonna open up to trying to answer that question that you rightfully said is a very hard one to answer. But so we have these very ambitious housing targets for a massive increase in the amount of housing to be constructed. And my question is, how can we ensure that the housing is more responsive to unmet needs? And I guess with that, we're thinking about planning reforms, but we're also thinking about what role can government play to ensure that non-market housing developers and non-market housing providers, profits, cooperatives, can play a much larger role in the provision of that to help achieve that goal. So I guess we'll just go down the line again and start with.
Well, again, I'm going to challenge the framing of that. That's like me kind of asking myself, okay, well, where am I going to have dinner after I win the Cy Young Award, right? This idea that, well, yeah, we're going to get 1.5, sure, but how can we make sure it's the right 1.5 or 3.5 or whatever? I'm talking Ontario numbers right now. So I don't think our policymakers really and our general public really understand how much of a challenge that's going to be. We have never in this province ever built more than 850,000 homes in any 10 years. We have not built more than 750,000 in any 10-year period since 1973 to 1982. Recently, we had the 40th anniversary of the last episode of MASH. The last time we built 750,000 homes is when they were making new episodes of MASH. So basically, we basically need to do something we haven't done in 40 years and then double it. This is a moonshot. I think we need to sort of understand this challenge. So first of all, I think we need to be very, very aware. But second of all, I don't want to just scare people, provide solutions. Obviously, zoning issues, parking minimums, a lot of regulatory issues are going to be important. Here in Ottawa, we had an affordable development blocked. An affordable development on an LRT line blocked because City Council wanted 9 more parking spots. So, so we have to, first of all, I think the first thing we need to do is do no harm. Stop blocking affordable developments. But beyond that, even if we waved a magic wand and got all the regulatory issues correct, we don't have the labor to do it. We don't have enough electricians and plumbers and roofers. We need to train more people. We need to change our immigration programs. My dad, there we go, yeah, you can, I'll allow applause. I'm happy with applause. My dad was a sheet metal worker, did HVAC work in apartments. I'm a university professor. Right now, our immigration system is biased towards bringing in people like me and biased against bringing in people like my dad. We need fewer people like me, we need more people like my dad, and I'm not just saying that because I want to limit the competition. But we need to do other things. We build homes basically the same way my dad did back in the 1960s and 70s. We don't build cars the same way, we don't build television, we don't build anything else the same way. We need more innovation. We need more innovation and productivity in this space. The federal government has a lot of innovation programs. Where are they on housing? Why don't we have a housing supercluster to try and build innovation in this space? And then finally, I think we need to look at tax reform. Right now, a lot of our tax system is weighted to take those billions and trillions of dollars sloshing around international markets of speculating and buying up existing homes. What if instead of saying, no, the money's bad, what if we could tweak our tax system to incentivize putting shovels in the ground and actually use that money to build more purpose-built rentals and apartments? So we need more labor, more money, more productivity, as well as all of these labor issues, or all of these regulatory issues that we've been discussing on this panel.
Great, go ahead, Dill.
So this is going to sound really, really bad, but Mike stole all of my points. But
that's why I sat here.
No, but to build upon what the other panelists have been saying, what we're missing, what other people have hinted upon, and Carolyn's hinted upon, is we need leadership. We need leadership at the national level, right? And what we mean by that, and we've been going on about this for years and years and now, right? What we've said is that we need a permanent housing roundtable or a permanent housing task force. You can call it whatever you want to show leadership at the national national level to bring together what we're talking about. How do we put a dent in that housing that we need across this country? And in some ways, it really does sound. The truth of the matter is, it is. And I'll give you a perfect example. The perfect example that I can give is about 4 weeks ago, I was at a roundtable discussion in Windsor, Ontario. If everyone here in Windsor, Ontario, there is our electric battery power plants going in for electric cars, right? And so what they've recognized is that they need thousands of new units of housing. And at this roundtable basically was the mayor of Windsor, who is the head of Rob Ford's task force on housing, along with builders, developers from affordable housing all the way through, including MPP Gretzky, who was an NDP MP, MP Massey was there as well, right? But the discussion basically was around this table, how do we build the housing that we need for the Windsor area, right? And the mayor basically looked at everyone around the table, from the affordable housing developers all the way through to the market housing, and was like, do not have the planning staff available in my city to be able to put shovels in the ground and prove all the projects that you all have out there. But the truth is, we need all of those projects approved and moved faster, right? But the other thing that happened at that moment was that all of them started raising the concerns and issues that they had. They would say, Dill, we're trying to access this CMHC housing program to build this amount of affordable housing, and we can't access it for this reason. We're trying to use this program to build this type of, you know what I mean, energy efficient housing, and we're not able to access that program to be able to use it. We have all of these federal programs, provincial programs that exist, but no one is talking to each other, where there is no leadership at the national level all the way through down, so that we can be talking about. The truth is, there is best practices going on in this country, some really simplistic. And everyone would, and I sort of joke about this, but one of the things that we deal in this country is that we have winter, right? Winter has the ability to affect our building season, right? But why is it that in parts of Niagara, in parts of, what's it called, Calgary, we're building homes and factories, right, where you can build year-round, right? And when the spring comes around, you roll these homes that you've built in these factories out on flatbeds, and you put them up, and you put them up really, really fast. Why are we not talking about this? There's innovation going on in pockets all around the country, but there's no leadership at the national level to bring all of this together, right? And that's truly what we need, is leadership.
I'm going to try and make different points so it doesn't sound like an echo chamber of four people agreeing on everything. So, yeah, I think the one little obvious thing that I would say is the reality is that for a number of decades now, governments, both, I think, political leaders and, to a certain extent, civil service, has not been honest with the public around housing. The numbers that we're talking about are so gargantuan now that it's actually, like, you get to a point, humans aren't the greatest at understanding numbers past a certain point. Like, most humans don't really get the scale of difference between a billion and a million. It's 33 years if you were to count in seconds versus 11 days. So when we start talking about these numbers, it's hard for people to understand what that really means. And governments for decades now have approached this topic in a way that has not been honest with the public, that has forced us to now talk about numbers that seem large, but they're actually not even large enough. So when we really talk about what's needed, the scale is so high and so hard, given some of the logistical realities. It's hard for us to be able to move forward because we haven't had an honest conversation. And I make this point about, like, senior urban planners and planning staff within municipalities across the country have not been honest with the public, because they have crafted reports and recommendations based off of the sort of political calculus of what they think is possible to be passed at those councils. And politicians have catered to largely the land-owning, property-owning class because they vote, and renters don't. Renters don't organize and vote the way that property owners do, and in most cities, the property owners tend to be older and whiter and richer, and they organize and they vote for their interests, which is, they love it when their property values are going up 20, 30% year over year. So there's just a correction that needs to happen on that side of things. But to move to the question, sorry, that was a long tangent. So what can governments do? First thing I'll say is give land back to the indigenous nations to build housing on it. So that's one. That's easy. Easy. It's easy. But I think in terms of what government can do, so I do think that there's a bit of a red herring in terms of trying to focus on, it comes out in different ways, but the right kind of housing. So the challenge there is, Evan Siddell was a former CEO for CMHC, said this on a panel I was on with him a few years ago, which is that every new unit of housing is good. It's just that some are better than others. So if you build 6 million new single detached houses, great, fine, so be it. It's not my ideal form of housing that we should be building. I think there's better tenures, better forms, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the land use decisions, even if you want to go and triple, quadruple, 10 times investment of federal money into co-op and nonprofit housing, you're still going to hit the problem that municipalities have zoned their land and are picking land use strategies that don't enable those types of housing. In Vancouver, because of land costs, it's so expensive, you need a minimum of 14 stories on a site in order for a nonprofit to be able to build social housing at a different income mix to be able to finance that project without any government grants. You would still need government financing on the construction loans, but no government subsidies, no government grants. You need 14 stories to make the economics of that work. But we don't, in any of our cities, allow nonprofits or co-ops or the community housing sector to build housing by right. They have to go through lengthy processes, public hearings, and they have to face the sort of opposition to those. It's the same for purposeful rental and other types of housing. So the land use question is the big one, whether it's market or non-market. But at the end of the day, the other sort of piece on it is it comes down to governments exist, whether it's municipally, provincially, or federally, to represent constituents and the public to be able to either extract public good from the economy to be able to benefit our society. And they have a lot of control over land use decisions. And they have a lot of ability to extract the value from that power through the rights that they can give for air, essentially, by building up. And to be able to extract that value in different ways and more effective ways, to be able to get a lot of more housing built quicker. That's what governments need to start doing, but we also need the public to be able to show up and start shifting the Overton window on this. So it's not just a certain class of property owners and wealthy individuals who are indentured into that sort of class of political interests being able to influence and control the decisions that are made within City Hall or the provinces or the feds. And then ultimately, I think when municipalities at a micro-regional level can't do that, then the provinces need to step in and force them. Yeah.
So again, I'll build on, I'm glad that Kel Sullum said urban land back, because I think that's where we start. And there's one tiny little project that's Unitarian Church to Ontario Aboriginal Housing Coalition in Ontario, in Ottawa rather, great. That's a start, lots more. Okay, now I'm going to move on. I was teaching housing policy to 40 students each time at the University of Toronto, thanks to the wonder of Zoom, although I live in Ottawa. Every time I'd ask this class of 40 undergraduate students, do you see yourself living in Toronto in 10 years? Do you know how many saw themselves living in Toronto in 10 years? Duck eggs, 0. Okay? So if this is a group of progressive policy thinkers, you really need to think about the next election, and you need to think about these young voters and they are going to be hearing really simplistic things. We've heard it from Doug Ford, we've heard it from Pierre Poilievre, we've heard it from some candidates in Toronto, for instance. We're going to make home ownership affordable for you with no evidence. I would really love to see a progressive plan that says this is what we're going to do. It's a crisis that isn't going to be solved overnight because it's at least 30, 40, 50 years in the making. You've been hearing that. But I think it's really important that we start off with nonprofit housing. It's not the whole solution. It's essential lifeboats. We're not going to get housing first without a lot more nonprofit housing. We're not going to at all address homelessness. The NHS has been completely ineffective in addressing homelessness and housing precarity. So we need to start off from a rights-based perspective with those who are most vulnerable. We need to look at what has worked in the past. So I'll give an example, often a favorite progressive example, Sweden. Sweden, 1965, 6 million people. They built 1 million homes in 10 years for 6 million people. If you take that to the Canadian population today, that would be 7 million homes for 40 million people. And it was done on the back of modular. It has created homes that still exist and communities that still exist. It also led to all kinds of spin-offs, like IKEA. IKEA came out of Swedish modular housing. If you're talking about economic transformation and climate change action, look at modular, look at a federal approach towards zoning bylaws, also look at a federal approach towards tenant protection, I would suggest, just as right now we're going, wow, we need national standards for healthcare because this is shambolic. We need national standards for housing because this is shambolic, okay? I'll give a more recent example from Australia, where I lived for 2 decades before returning to Canada. The global financial crisis hits. A progressive prime minister creates 2 programs, one a national rental scheme that only maintained affordability for 10 years, don't much like it, a social housing scheme, and that kind of infrastructure investment, as many billions as it cost, is one of the factors that helped Australia be resilient or protective to inevitable financial downturns. It makes sense, it gets votes, it saves lives. Let's talk about doing it.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on to our last question after this. Before we do so, I want to, there were a lot of great points here. I really want to underline something that Carl Salem said and a few people said. As of right zoning, high density for nonprofits and cooperatives mixed in with a mixed income model where you get half of those as like deeply affordable, if you get some capital grants for that, and then a mix of different levels of affordability. And also harking back to this question of, one of the greatest supply shortages in history was in post-war Europe, and social democratic governments using public housing models to get a handle on that, I think, is one of the great achievements of social democracy. And so certainly that's an exciting precedent to look back on when thinking about how to address the situation we're in. But we've been talking a lot about expanding affordable supply, and I think that for working class communities across this country who are really facing the brunt of the affordable housing crisis, a more pressing question is, how are we going to protect the existing supply of affordable rental that people are clinging onto like life rafts right now? And so I guess the question I want to ask is, what lessons can we learn from models that we're seeing, in certain provinces, certain local governments, but also First Nations communities, for how to empower communities and support communities to get a control on the surge in rents and to protect themselves from the surge in evictions we're seeing and of displacement, which frankly is causing a great level of trauma in communities across this country. Why don't we go backwards this time? I want to start with Carolyn Weitzman, and I'll just say the Housing Assessment Resource Tool, which is being launched, the UBC project.
March 29th.
I hope we'll hear a bit about it. This is a project that gets a really good handle on the scope of the loss of affordable housing we're seeing, and so. But yeah, we've got 10 minutes left, so I guess try to keep 2 to 3 minutes max. Let's do math here. 2 minutes each for that.
Right. So there's a couple of possible approaches. One of them is a national acquisition strategy, which would help build up the asset base of nonprofits and help address the hemorrhage of low-cost housing. Nova Scotia, City of Montreal, City of Toronto has a very small one. BC, most notably, has an acquisitions policy. I just want to make clear that without new supply, an acquisitions policy is going to be rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, but acquisitions policy is one possible intervention. A national approach towards certainly rental protection and possibly rent control would be a second approach. I think it's really important to look at real estate investment trusts, etc. But to me, they're a symptom. They're not the problem. And what we really need to look at, as Pogo said many years ago, let's look at the enemy, and it's us, okay? It's actually a culture that has been built up that home ownership is the only investment that you can do to secure your retirement future. And homeowners, through property taxes, etc., make windfall profits all the time. So you can look at a few bad guys if you want, but I would really look at homeowners like me who are like, yeah, I just bought, my electric car and I just traded in my gas stove for, an induction stove. But also, I'm really uncomfortable about this development because it's getting in the way of neighborhood character, or the height's too high, or that kind of thing. Let's just stop that nonsense right now, and let's accept the fact that homeowners are benefiting from renters. And every time, frankly, we do development charges and inclusionary zoning, and we say we're making the developer pay, we're not. We're actually making the poor private renter pay. And let's accept that.
So there's a couple things. The issue of losing affordable units in Canada is its own crisis, and it's been a sort of an issue that the nonprofit housing sector, I think, especially in BC, has been raising for many years. Fortunately, it was just announced last month that the BC government's going to be creating a $500 million fund with a new entity that will be set up specifically so that nonprofits can purchase existing older stock rental before investment firms are able to purchase them or outbid them for the purpose of retaining those units. So things like that, are obviously, I think, helpful and useful. Changes in provincial or municipal policy around rental protection and relocation, also really helpful. Rate of return, compensation between moves, or different ways that people can be subsidized by the development company between moves. All of that, I think, is great and wonderful and should be done. The best thing, though, that we can do to help renters is to build until we hit 7% vacancy rates in all of our expensive markets. That's what we have to do. Because at the end of the day, if you are a renter, and in Vancouver, you have the challenge of 100 people lining up for a 30, or what was it? I'm trying to remember the numbers now. A $3,800 apartment, 2-bedroom, about 500 square feet. It had 100 people lining up to rent it, 1 unit. So as long as landlords are able to control and influence and have that much effective control over renters, and there's so little freedom and choice, that's the situation we're in, that it's always going to be tough for renters. If it's the inverse, there was 100 units and there's 10 people looking, the landlords are going to be in such a precarious position to fill those units. And I can tell you this from the development side, there's a whole calculus that goes on around how many units are going to be vacant, how often they're vacant, and the cost that puts onto the development company. They would rather have those units rented, even if it's not at the ideal dollar price that they had, because it's money coming in as opposed to zero coming in. But as long as vacancy rates are so abysmally low, renters are always going to be on the short end of that stick, and we have to build until vacancy rates get to healthy. I don't think 3 is healthy. I say 7. Maybe I'm trying to bid high, so we end somewhere a little bit in between. But that's the reality of our challenge. And I know I didn't talk about it much in this because I kind of didn't want to, but the Sanok development that we're doing with the Squamish Nation. So 11 acres of land, 6,000 units, 20% at a 25%, 20% of the units at a 25% below market discount, on the rest 80% at market rents, and very close to downtown Vancouver. The only reason that we can anticipate a $5 or $6 a square foot rent, which, by the way, when we started looking at that project, we were talking about a $4.25 per square foot. We're now looking at $5.50 to $6 by the time we open vacancy or open for tenancy. The only reason that we as a government who are doing market development can anticipate a dollar value at that amount is because we know that the rest of the city is not going to build enough housing, and that we're going to be bringing most of the housing online at that time. So we know that, and we're anticipating the constrained supply is going to help drive a premium on our apartments. And that's how a lot of the development community will look at these things. And it's also how the investment firms are looking at this and why they're buying up the older stock rental, because they're anticipating that a constrained supply is going to drive a premium in these highly desirable locations. So I think you want to help renters, they've got to build a lot of housing.
Okay, so fully agree with what all the panelists have said. To try to go somewhere different, really challenging thing to say, but I'll put it out there. Other panelists have sort of hinted upon this. The truth of the matter is that we have built housing in this country at a really rapid pace at one time in its history. And the truth is that was actually the core mandate of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation when it was actually developed, right? And that happened after World War II, right? They built the entire town of Ajax, right? So what I would say, so fully agree with what my colleagues are saying, but to put up a different point, maybe we need to challenge the core mandate of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation and what they're doing. And so I just put that out there.
Wow, okay, my comments aren't going to be nearly as controversial as that. We have to recognize in Ontario that a lot of this rental demand is coming from students and increase in enrollment. We're letting the higher education sector off the hook. They need to be building more student residences. That's why London, Ontario, home of Western and Fanshawe, have rents going up 25% year over year. It's because our enrollments are going through the roof, and colleges and universities are not building residences. So we need them to do that, and that's going to require provincial and possibly federal support. So that is a simple, not a simple, but that is a straightforward thing we could do to get more affordable rentals in mid-sized cities, build more student residences.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much to our panelists here, and thanks again to Tsahai for all their insights. I know there are many subjects, there are many issues that we didn't get to touch on, tonight. This afternoon, such as, the desperate need for more supportive housing, the frankly unconscionable state of homelessness that is on our sidewalks of our country today, and the many other, violations that are being experienced to the rights to, adequate affordable housing, which we've seen a commitment to, but we have not seen real progress on for, compared to how much worse things have been getting in recent years. But I really want to thank our panelists for helping us think through kind of ways that we can move forward on these issues. And I hope you all have a great weekend. It's the end of the event. So cheers.